Welcome again, friends. Our next section in the Large Catechism series is on the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are the law given by God to Moses, as recorded in Exodus chapter 20 and recapped in Deuteronomy chapter 5. In his catechisms, Luther follows the numbering of the commandments according to the Latin Vulgate Bible instead of a more direct translation from the Hebrew Bible. Others, especially Reformed theologians, who are not to be confused with the Lutheran Reformation movement, use the prohibition of graven images as a separate commandment from the first. So you may notice, especially if you look at other catechisms, that the Catholic and Lutheran commandments may look a little bit different from, say, the Presbyterians' list. The commandments can be divided into what we call the two tables. The first, detailing how we are to relate to God, and the second, describing how we are to relate to our neighbor. One of Luther's daily practices was to recite the Ten Commandments, the Creed, and the Lord's Prayer together with selections from the Psalms. The first table contains the first three commandments. You may have learned many of these as thou shalt or thou shalt not. The most recent edition of the Book of Concord has updated the language to reflect the fact that the thou construction we see in a lot of older church writings is not really meant to be the formal version of you, but was in fact once the familiar you. The main reason we understand thou as formal now is because it's just not a word we use anymore, and we only really see it in contexts where we're reading older church documents or Bible translations, and thou refers to God, which seems to our human ears like it should be the more formal you. But that's really not the relationship God wants to have with us. So the first three commandments in contemporary English are, you are to have no other gods besides me, you are not to take the name of God in vain, and you are to hallow the day of rest. The big question Luther wants us to answer in exploring the meaning of the first commandment is, what does it mean to have a God? Or, put another way, when things go well, to whom do we give thanks? And when we're in trouble, to whom do we call out? Or to put it another way still, in what or in whom do we place our trust? This doesn't have any effect on who God is, but it does affect our relationship with God, and the way we think about God is going to have an effect on the way we treat other people. In the text, Luther names a host of other small g gods that people have, such as money and power, wisdom, prestige and honor, a good family name, the things lots of people desire that aren't of themselves bad, until trust in those things starts to replace trust in God. Luther also railed a little bit against the practice of praying to various saints instead of praying directly to God. He was especially suspicious of practices that deflected trust in God but were clothed in religious piety. To put it in more modern terms, we should trust that God thinks enough of us as God's children that we can pray to God directly, rather than feeling like we need to leave a message with God's receptionist. Luther that tells us that this commandment requires a lot from us. Thus, you can easily understand what and how much this commandment requires, namely, that one's whole heart and confidence be placed in God alone and in no one else. To have a God means that you lay hold of God when your heart grasps him and clings to him. Here we have the true honor and worship that please God, that the heart should know no other consolation or confidence than in him, nor let itself be torn from him. The second table of the Ten Commandments tells us how we are to relate to the neighbor. This table contains the fourth through the 10th commandments. You are to honor your father and mother. You are not to kill. You are not to commit adultery. You are not to steal. You are not to bear false witness against your neighbor. You are not to covet your neighbor's house. You are not to cover your neighbor's wife, manservant, maidservant, cattle, or anything that is his. Again, we are discussing these selectively, so we will start with the fourth commandment. The fourth commandment naturally receives the obvious interpretation that we are to honor our earthly parents, obey them, love them, and even help and care for them when they are old and feeble. This commandment is something of a hinge between the first table, how we relate to God, and the second table, how we relate to the neighbor, in that God has set certain authorities in our lives as an extension of who God is. Luther wrote that God has given this walk of life, that is, parenthood, a special position of honor higher than any other walk of life under it. Luther also extended the spirit of this commandment to include not just parents by blood, but leaders of households and governmental authorities. In a household, servants and staff owe the head of the household the same honor and are expected to do their work happily and well, because the head of the household is responsible for them. Similarly, those in civil authority are also responsible for a large number of people, and is thus comparable to parenthood because through civil authorities, in Luther's words, God gives us food, house and home, protection, and security. Those in authority, Luther says, should keep in mind that they owe obedience to God, and that above all, they should earnestly and faithfully discharge the duties of their office, not only to provide for the material support of their children, servants, subjects, etc., but especially to bring them up to the praise and honor of God. The office of authority, whichever type of authority is conferred, is not to be taken lightly. Luther begins his explanation of the eighth commandment, you are not to bear false witness against your neighbor, with the acknowledgement that after our own body, spouse, and property, the dearest treasure we have is our good name and reputation. Therefore, he writes to us, God does not want our neighbors to be deprived of their reputation, honor, and character any more than their money or possessions. In its simplest meaning, Luther says, this applies in a court of law, and that we should help our neighbor retain their legal rights. But it extends farther than that to encompass all sins of the tongue, whereby we might injure or offend our neighbor. This applies as much to gossip and slander as it does to blasphemous teachings. Luther tells us there is a great difference between judging sin and having knowledge of sin. And unless it is our duty to judge, that is, like we've been elected judge in the town, while we may certainly be aware of our neighbor's sins, it is not for us to discuss this with other people. Anything you cannot directly prove should be regarded as false witness. Luther lifts up the process outlined in Matthew 18 when a neighbor sins against you directly, where Christ says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Luther says we should use our tongue to speak only the best about all people, to cover the sins and infirmities of our neighbors, to justify their actions, and to cloak and veil them with our own honor. Or, as the Small Catechism tells us, interpret everything our neighbor does in the best possible light. I want to point out one thing from Luther's Small Catechism with African descent reflections. Taken at their face, some things in Luther's explanation of the Eighth Commandment in the Large Catechism could be read as a defense against providing information about crimes that had been committed to the authorities, known in some communities as snitching. The African descent reflections actually point out that sometimes we need to tell something that ought to be told for the common good, because snitching actually helps the community become stronger and not weaker. Here are some questions for reflection as we go into the next session. Do you think any of the commandments might mean something different than they did in Luther's time? And if so, which ones and why? Luther believed God ordered the commandments in order of importance. Based on this, how would you change the order and why? Finally, review the remaining commandments. Based on Luther's commentary that we shared tonight on our relationship with God and our neighbor, how much you interpret some of the other commandments. We'll see you next time for session 3.